We are back on Humanity in the Headlines. Again, I'm your host, Atiba Buchanan, joined by none other than David Seaton. So today we are talking about the innocence of Black children. And again, the catalyst for this conversation was the video from about a week ago in Michigan, where the officers, again, pulled up on the young Black adolescents, held them at gunpoint in a case of mistaken identity. And every time I watch this video, Dave, and I've watched it 3 or 4 times, the first time was the most difficult, but every time I watch it, I'm literally moved to tears because I'm blown away at how uncaring the officer was. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to play devil's advocate a little bit and talk about the options the officer may have had. But when I hear that one kid wailing in the back, crying uncontrollably, and not even able to be consoled, that was heart-wrenching for me. I have 2 children. Most of my listeners know a 19-year-old and a 16-year-old, and I imagine them in that situation. My son in particular, because my oldest is a girl, but my 16-year-old son, and I know the long-lasting impact an encounter like that would have on him. And it hurts me to see a 12-year-old, 11-year-old be treated that way, because all I think about is what does that? They will never be the same.
Right.
They will never be the same. The way that they view innocence, the way that they view good and bad, the way that they view right and wrong will forever be changed. And I thought that was just heart-wrenching.
Again, as an African-American man having experienced that, whenever I see a video like that, it automatically takes me back to my experiences that I've had throughout the years with police officers. And to your point, even today, a lot of my opinions, a lot of my views of law enforcement in general is shaped not by the good things that they do, but by the bad experiences that I've personally had. So I can't help but look at policemen and law enforcement through the prism of my own experience. And I would suspect that that's how everyone views it.
Well, joining us today to help us unpack this, to help us navigate this very lofty and necessary conversation. This is the first time that she's been on our show, so I'd love to introduce our first time guest to our listeners and our viewers. Joining us today is Dr. Stacey Patton. Ms. Patton, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Thank you so much. We're doing just fine. If you could just take a quick moment and tell our listeners just a little bit about you, what you do.
So I am a journalist, author of a new book called Spare the Rod. Spare the Kids, Why Whooping Children Won't Save Black America. And I'm a child advocate whose work focuses on the treatment of African American children, and that treatment is by the state, in schools, by their parents. And I'm also a trained historian whose work has focused on the historical devaluation of Black children from slavery going forward. And my work is about enlightening people on these issues, particularly African American parents, so we can figure out healthier strategies to make sure our children get ushered through childhood into adulthood safely.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. So you came to my attention because I had seen your piece written in the Washington Post. In America, Black children don't get to be children. Now, I can tell you I knew this piece was going to be fire because you wrote it on my birthday, November 26th. But beyond that, actually, it was an amazing read. So there was so many things that to me were just, again, quote worthy. When I read one of the first things that you say is, America does not extend the fundamental elements of childhood to Black boys and girls. Black childhood is considered innately inferior, dangerous, and indistinguishable from Black adulthood. Black children are not afforded the same presumption of innocence as white children, especially in life or death situations. If you could explain that and what the motivation for that statement.
Well, I was paying attention to all the shootings, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, and so on and so forth, and listening to the language that was used to describe these young boys, whether it was a fixation on their physiognomy, describing Tamir Rice, who was 12 years old, as a 20-year-old man, Mike Brown as some kind of Hulk Hogan, or Incredible Hulk image, like, that whole Black Beast narrative, or, the defense attorney for George Zimmerman repeatedly calling Trayvon Martin a man, or bringing out cutout cardboard, pictures of him and George Zimmerman to accentuate the size difference between the two. That trial was not just about the guilt or innocence of George Zimmerman, but whether Trayvon Martin was even a child. Yet the prosecutor kept trying to restore Trayvon Martin to childhood, to say this was a scared boy going home at night with candy and iced tea in his hand. And so he had to try to convince the jury that this was a boy who was stalked and afraid for his life. And ultimately, the jury didn't believe that. So when we look at these cases over and over again, we see these children being blamed for their own death. Tamir Rice, the judge who failed to prosecute or charge the officer who killed him, said that Tamir Rice should have known better because he was big for his age. He shouldn't have been in a park playing with a toy gun. And so this is a through line throughout American history. It's not anything new. We see the same sort of rhetoric in the late 19th and early 20th century with lynching, particularly the lynching of children. And so it is necessary to deny Black children any semblance of innocence and the privileges and protections that are also afforded to white children.
That's a profound breakdown of that entire thing. This is David Seaton, and Dr. Patton, thank you for joining us today. Let me play devil's advocate right off the bat, just so we can frame this conversation correctly. A lot of what you're talking about stereotypes, but stereotypes from the perception of the police officers when they're talking about these Black children were big, or Hulk Hogan or whatever. But a lot of those stereotypes are based somewhat in fact, and then they are just blown out of proportion and then generalized. So I guess my question is, right off the bat, what responsibility does the African American community have behavior that perhaps plays a role in the misperception of us by police officers?
So it's not our responsibility to figure out ways to get white people to take control of their racial imagination, because it was white people who constructed those stereotypes and racial ideas for centuries. They built an entire discourse around our bodies through science, through, popular imagery, through music. This goes all the way back to the first Europeans who went to Africa and wrote about how we were so different and savage and uncivilized, and brought those narratives back here and throughout the diaspora and Europe to justify the theft and treatment of our bodies and to deny us humanity. The majority of the captives who were brought from West Africa were teenagers and children. They weren't adults. These were people who hadn't even completed childhood yet. And so it was through that brutality, that treatment for centuries, on plantations. They had to create this narrative to justify, exploiting and treating us the way that they did. But it continued during the Jim Crow period with lynching. You have to understand, the problem is with white people. It's not Black folks. We are not the problem. And so you have people who, in their cultural memory, in their DNA, it has almost become an intuitive response when they see Black bodies, is to fear them and to destroy them. Black people can pull up their pants, They can educate themselves. They can be law-abiding. They can be respectable people. That's still not going to save us. And so this isn't about looking at us and trying to make ourselves look good or smaller or less threatening to white people. None of that has ever saved Black folks.
And I'm glad, and that's why I'm glad we straightened that out right from the outset of the conversation, because it brings to mind when the Human Genome Project first started in the 80s. I remember seeing a show on Donahue. I might be dating myself by saying that, but I remember on the Donahue show that they had some members of the Human Genome Project, and they were having a conversation about whether or not African Americans could even be classified as human based on the initial genetic research that they were doing. Just to underscore your point, that this is so much deeper than, to you, like you just said, pulling one's pants up or behaving a certain way, when the perception is so deeply ingrained in the culture and in the hierarchy that, let's just say it, that white supremacy has set up in this country.
Yeah, you have to understand, I say this a lot when I'm on the road and talking to different parent groups and training folks, that white supremacy is about the destruction of humanity at every turn. And the first logical step in that process is to seize and destroy Black children. And this process begins at preconception, in the moment of birth, infancy, adolescence, and the ultimate destruction at puberty, if it doesn't happen before that. This destruction process happens spiritually, intellectually, emotionally, and physically. It happens in all of our systems, the medical profession, schools, juvenile justice, those who are unfortunate enough to end up in foster care, at every process. And what this country has done, going all the way back to the plantation experience, is to create an elusive kind of Black parenting, where the only power that this white supremacist paradigm has willingly afforded to Black parents and other caretakers is the ability to participate in that dehumanization process. Namely thinking that, oh, if we beat our kids, it'll keep them from, getting in trouble in the streets or keep the cops from killing them. Here you had these boys who were going home from playing basketball. They were doing absolutely nothing wrong. And so we end up participating in that dehumanization process and calling it love. And we express outrage when we see these types of scenes over and over and over. This isn't the first time that young Black children have had guns pulled out on them by police officers or tased or slammed to the ground for just being free. We have to understand that a free Black child is America's worst nightmare. And so you have to seize them and control them and destroy them. This is what white supremacy requires. And Black people need to understand that. And so rather than us constantly complaining and showing outrage at these things, we need to talk about legitimate forms of self-defense and protecting our kids and fighting for our kids in very, very radical ways. You don't read stories about this happening to white kids. Ask ourselves, why do we see videos of police officers pulling guns out on white children or slamming them or, stopping them in this way and saying, oh, they fit some description or whatever?
Quite the contrary to your point. We see plenty of videos, and I know Atiba and I were sharing this video one time that was on YouTube where this police officer was wrestling with this Caucasian young kid at a beach in Florida, and the kid reached for his gun, and this struggle went on for several minutes, and never did the police officer think about pulling his firearm on that white child. So it begs the question, like you just said, why are Black children treated so differently?
And once again, this is rooted in a very, very long and complicated history. It used to be thousands of years ago that Europeans regarded their own children as savages, as beasts. And they used to brutalize their own kids. They used to do all kinds of horrible things. And they did not recognize that their own children were children until about the 16th century. It was a very, very slow progression. And then it continued very slowly from the 16th century forward to the 20th century, where they recognized that children should be afforded innocence and protection and be spared from the same kind of brutal violence and brute force that you might see meted out onto adults. But in the 16th century, something else also happened. They started seeing this enterprise where Black bodies are taken from Africa and brought here. And Europeans needed to justify what they were doing by imposing a category onto Africans. And that category was the concept of childhood, civilizational childhood. So Black people would always be savages and stuck in a continuous limbo of childhood. But then they looked and they said, we can't have our own children occupying such close proximity with these civilizational, beastly African children. And so then they recategorized white childhood as something that was full of futurity, full of future promise. And they would become adults, civilized adults. They would move through that savagery. Not the same for Black people. So Black people, Black adults and children would ultimately continue to occupy the same vulnerable category of brutalized childhood. That's why you can have Black children and adults who were killed and treated in this way and never see it happening with a white child.
Absolutely amazing information today, Dr. Patton. Thank you so much for sharing that and walking us through that. I was reading another one of your pieces where you in the New York Times, where you talk about stop beating Black children. And one thing that really caught my eye in that article is when you took us back to Western Africa before colonialism, before the introduction of Western civilization, and how Africans viewed treating their children. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, so I hear a lot of Black folks say, we have to whip our children to keep them safe. We have to whip them because if we don't do it, the police will beat them or kill them, or our kids will end up in prison. And I always respond to that and say, well, how's that working for Black America? If whipping children kept them safe from gun-toting police officers, if it kept them out of prisons, then why are we having these conversations about police brutality and mass incarceration? It's not saving us from any of that. And I say, whipping children might be prevalent in our communities, but it's not native to us, not intuitive to our culture. It was something that was embedded in it. And so I say we don't even begin this conversation by looking at what happened to us on the plantation or even West African cultures. You go back 2,000 years of European history and talk about the ways that they were so traumatized. They traumatized their own kids, and they bought that trauma and those destructive, toxic beliefs about kids and their behaviors into cultures through colonialism, slavery, and indoctrination into Christianity. Our West African ancestors were not Christian. And so I also look at and remind people about the number of children who were captives, who were brought here. They were not mostly adults who came from the same tribes, spoke the same languages, shared the same religious beliefs, or even conceptions about children and child rearing, and then brought those same ideas here, and they were uninterrupted by white plantation owners. That's not what happened. The exact opposite happened. And so we have to interrogate where that behavior came from and how it's counterintuitive and how it sows the seeds for aggressive behavior and deviancy and all types of other issues within our community. So we have to understand this history and how it's not protecting us and how it actually makes our children more vulnerable to be victimized by these structural forces, including the police.
And when I was reading your article in the New York Times and I saw the article, spare the rod, the first thing it took me to was my own childhood growing up in the Black Baptist Christian church, and that was I remember that was just a very prevalent theme that spare the rod, spoil the child, and the rod was thought of as a very literal thing. It was thought of as a belt or something that was meant to inflict pain, to try and coerce behavior, or to try and get better behavior out of our children or out of children in general. But again, when you put it in that historical context of how an entire race of people was basically infantilized, you had adults and children that were treated as property. Then you could use that same theory of spare the rod, spoil the child. And I put child in quotation marks there because now the slave master could use religion as an excuse for the physical abuse that was being exerted on an entire group of people.
Mm-hmm. And then we embrace the same concept. And then spare the rod, spoil the child isn't even in the Bible. That's number one. People misquote it. And they don't understand Hebrew, like the Hebrew interpretation of rod as a symbol, as a walking stick, as a scepter, as a, sort of hook that you would help to rescue a sheep that might have gotten, caught somewhere. The only time a shepherd would wield that rod is against wolves that are trying to, harm the sheep. Sheep are very valuable, so you wouldn't hit them, to make them, to devalue them or to frighten them away. And so here we are, people misquoting a scripture in a book that was introduced to us by the people who enslaved us.
Right.
Our West African ancestors were not reading Bibles. And that whole concept of born in sin. Our West African ancestors did not believe that children were born in sin. They believed that they were reincarnated ancestors. The Nigerians would name their sons Babatunde, father has returned. Yedatunde, mother has returned. The Bang people would never put a child on the ground. They considered them gods. You wouldn't strike a beloved ancestor who already had a deeply spiritual life and had come here with their own special mission. Once again, it's colonialism, Christianity, and the enslavement process, which treated people like property, that altered our conceptions of our own children and how we treat them.
And that's even, someone just commented about this on our Facebook simulcast. I mean, a lot of what you're talking about, especially when we start introducing Christianity into this conversation and how it plays a part in the hierarchy of white and black in the United States, that we have several hundred years of people who have read a book, the Bible, that was originally written in Hebrew and Greek, that was translated into English and translated very poorly. It was transliterated, not translated, and then they're reading the poorly translated English translation and then trying to govern ourselves without going back and learning, regardless of whether or not you're a Christian or not. But if you're going to govern yourself by this book, going back and understanding what the original intent was of what was written before you govern yourself by that law, and then to this larger conversation, physically abuse your children in our society.
Exactly. And the other thing too is that, and folks will cherry pick the Old Testament. There's about 5 verses that people like to cite in Proverbs to justify hitting our kids. But there are also verses in Proverbs that talk about using a rod against adults. But I'm like, why cherry pick? If you want to start, having a literal interpretation of the Bible, why don't we bring back to death if they're disrespectful? Or why don't we make our daughters marry their rapists? It's all right there in the Old Testament. But why don't we move past the Old Testament if you must practice Christianity and think about the ways in which Jesus treated children? Jesus would never whoop a child. He said, we should emulate the nature of children. He never said, suffer the little children come unto me for a whooping. Never said.
Right. Right.
and what Black people also, here we go with history. For the first 100 years that our enslaved ancestors were in this country, they didn't practice Christianity in any significant number. Actually, slave masters and owners were reluctant to convert those first generations of African slaves to Christianity, because they didn't want them getting full of the idea that salvation could be theirs on earth, or that they were equal to white folks. It wasn't until the Great Awakening that this conversion started to happen in large numbers. So we've been only practicing Christianity for a little more than 200 years. Our original ancestors who disembarked from West Africa were either Muslim, where they were practicing, traditional African religion.
Spiritualism,
so we need to interrogate all of this and stop using it to justify the beating of our kids. And plus, African Americans need to start taking a careful look at the ways we talk about our own children, the way we market our children to the world. These kids today, they're so this and they're so that and they're so bad. And the larger white world listens to that. And so we show this outrage when things like this happen to our children on the streets, wherever we talk about why it's so racist for everybody else to fear our kids. But yet, look at the language that we use to describe our children on social media and in the other places. So if we want to demand respect for our children's humanity outside of our homes, outside of our communities, on our streets, in our schools, then we need to watch the ways in which we talk about our children and treat our children, instead of doing things like picking up cell phone cameras and recording ourselves shaming and beating our children and sharing that stuff on sites like World Star Hip Hop and Facebook and YouTube and so on and so forth. Our kids need to know that we will fight for our children, and instead of just constantly reacting in this defensive way when other people are abusive to them.
Excellent advice. I cannot tell you how much we appreciate having you on today. Again, I'd like, because these pieces you've written just both blew my mind. And I'd like to talk about one line that you wrote in particular when we're talking about your own childhood, if you don't mind.
No problem. Mm-hmm.
It says, by the time I was 12, I was in the state foster care system. You gave your case number. I still carry the scars. And then you said, fleshy braille that narrates the story of my childhood. And I had to stop reading. I had to like gather myself. Fleshy braille that narrates the story of my childhood. So you're talking about literal scars on your body that you can go back and say, yeah, I remember that day, and I remember that day. I mean, is that right?
It's exactly right. I wake up every morning, I look in the mirror, and I have extension cord marks on my face. You know, I have them on other parts of my body. I remember picking switches and having to go get the belt and those sorts of things. And, you know, and this was nothing to celebrate. I hear Black people tell similar stories of having welts on their body from getting whooped, and they'll look back nostalgically about that and say, oh, I'm the man I am today. I'm the woman I am today. I'm not in jail. I'm not on crack. You know, I got a degree, I have a job and a house, and, you know, I have all of this success because somebody whooped me. And when I hear Black people say these things, I think, wow, you agree with massa, because the long-standing racist narrative is that the only way to make Black people law-abiding, moral, you know, healthy, respectable, educated people is to process our bodies through violence and pain. And so it's really sad that I hear so many Black people, you know, invert violence against their bodies as something that is good.
Right. I mean, I think all of us have at least one friend that talks about how their parents used to whoop them with an extension cord, or go outside and get a switch and braid it, and or what have you. But let me get back to what you said. Let's go back for a second, because you said, when we first started talking, you were talking about solutions. And let me just say parenthetically, and I'd love to get your opinion on this as well, that when you started talking about the intersectionality of the African American experience in the church, there's always the conversation about how there are so many more Black women in the church than there are Black men. And I am of the opinion, and I'm speaking personally and from the conversations I've had, so this is anecdotal, but I believe it's really the case. The fact that there are so few Black men in the church is because men are innately, especially if we're talking about African American men, we are charged with protecting ourselves, our families, and our communities. And I think that there's an antithesis to what we experience in the Black church a lot of times.
Passivity.
Right. What the Black church offers a lot of times for the Black man is the antithesis of that same powerful thing that we're supposed to represent in terms of protecting ourselves and our families and our communities. Having said that, I mean, when I look at this video and I hear this mother in the background, and I see the policeman telling the mother, go back in the house. I mean, again, I can't imagine as a parent what my reaction would be if I saw a police officer holding my child at gunpoint and I'm trying to intervene to save the life of my child, and the police officer instructs me to go back into my house. I can't imagine how enraged I would be, but you could hear that mother was very upset, and she was reacting from a place of passivity. So what do we need to do as an African American community to assert our power, our dominance, and our authority to protect ourselves and our community when we're living in a society that, as we've outlined in this conversation, is everything that's the direct 180 degrees opposite of that?
I think that, and a lot of people are not going to like this answer, but I think it's time for African Americans to unleash our rage on those very systems. Back to the incident in South Carolina where a school resource officer, grabbed a child out of her seat and threw her across the classroom. I think about that pool party incident where a young girl was slammed on the ground and this white police officer sat on top of her body. And one of them was ready to pull a gun out on one of the teenagers as he was running away. I think about these things over and over again, and I'm thinking, why aren't these people showing up at why aren't they finding out where this cop lives and camping out on his front lawn? Why are we not unleashing our rage onto these people? And I think that because, we have been taught that obedience is our greatest virtue. That
obedience is better than sacrifice for those Black Baptists listening.
Right.
Yes, that we gotta pray, we gotta forgive these people.
Right.
This stuff justice takes time. Well, we've been at this for quite a few centuries. Except that the success of white supremacy requires the destruction of our children. We understand that. Understand that this is how it gets its inertia. It's about destroying us. These people don't want justice. They don't want racial equality. They want to preserve racial hierarchy. They want to preserve the system just the way it is. When we get that into our skull and really accept it and understand that these tactics that we've been using will never work, instead of meeting out all of our frustration onto our children's bodies, we might actually find the courage to strike back at, our enemies in very radical ways. But as a people, we're not ready for that conversation. We just aren't.
I mean, even to your point, white supremacy doesn't just require our obedience. It requires our acquiescence. Mm-hmm. It requires us to silently comply, and both literally and figuratively. So again, going back to a solution, is the solution community policing? Is the solution getting every kid out here or every person out here with a smartphone? Because we know these kids, they have their smartphones and they're happy to post on World Star, like you mentioned earlier, and Facebook and YouTube. But do we need to get these kids together?
Not either. As a whole, we've seen it over. We have seen Black folks live streaming their own deaths.
Right.
We've seen, folks put up a camera and show a grown man being choked to death in the middle of
New York,
broad daylight.
Right.
Don't forget shot in the back.
Nothing happens.
Right.
Shot in the back while running away. Nothing happens. There is no justice. We saw a 12-year-old boy. These police officers did a drive-by on him and then blamed him for it. When we understand that, once again, white supremacy requires this destruction, this state violence, and to acquit itself. When we get that into our head and understand that this could be any of us, all those boys could have been shot to death on the street, and we would have seen outrage, we would have seen more, protests and so on and so forth, and there would have been some reason to acquit that cop.
I've often said, I'm just giving, I know you want to, we're both trying to jump in. This is so powerful, but I have been quoted amongst my circle of friends by saying, it's time out for praying and preaching and protesting and marching. We've got to step it up to another level. And again, I feel where you're going, because you were kind of hesitant to go there, but those things have not worked. That those are just passive acquiescence on our part.
So let me go ahead and get in. This is Atiba now. So here's what I've pondered this quite a bit, Doctor, and you can let me know what you think. And this is just my humble little opinion, my own little thought process. But we often hear the phrase, violence is never the answer. And we hear that a lot. And we try to live up to that standard. And we try to live up to the standard that we should all be like what they tell us Dr. Martin Luther King was like, when we know that he was more radical than anything. But we always hear that phrase that violence is never the answer. Let me pose this question then. If violence is never the answer, why do we have a Second Amendment?
Right.
Why do we have a Second Amendment that says if the government behaves a certain way, then you have the ability and the right to do what? Be violent with that government.
Mm-hmm.
So what I've come to understand is the only time that violence is never the answer is when white people are being shot at. They're doing the shooting, then violence is perfectly okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's not violence when they do it.
Yeah. So and again, I'm not. Again, because we've done an excellent job today of framing this conversation in the right way, because what we are talking about, Dr. Patton, is white supremacy. And that that does not mean that every white person is racist, and that it doesn't mean that there aren't good white people out there. I have great white friends. That has nothing to do with that. But we're talking about these invisible systems, and it is that invisible system that tells us and tells every other minority group that violence is never the answer. But it's all but when it's time to get a pipeline, then violence is the answer.
Right.
When it's time to get you off of this plane, violence is the answer.
Right.
So that's what frustrates me with that whole conversation. So
Yep. It requires you to pray for it, to forgive it,
yes,
to try to reform it, to look at it and be peaceful while it's destroying you, while it's ready to lock and load again and then acquit itself. This is what it requires. Our forgiveness, our prayers, our marching, our singing, our turning the other cheek is a form of therapy for our enemies.
Here's the larger question. Has the assimilation of African Americans into the society in the United States, African Americans who, it was only 2 generations ago where Brown versus Board of Education happened, and now we're able to go to school. It was only less than 2 generations ago when the Fair Housing Act was passed, and now African Americans can pretty much live wherever they want to live. Has the assimilation of African Americans pacified us to the point where we're to your like we've been talking about in this conversation, we'll march and we'll pray and we'll protest, but until we are willing to put our bodies on the line, until we are willing to say, you are not. Martin Luther King even said, if you haven't, no, it wasn't Martin Luther King, wasn't Malcolm X. It might have been Malcolm X. If you haven't found something it was Malcolm X. I mean Martin Luther King that said, if you haven't found something that you're willing to die for, you're not worthy to live.
Right.
That was Martin Luther King. My point being that I think it is the problem that we become too concerned with materialism and the comforts of assimilation that it becomes easier to turn a blind eye to these incidents when they happen.
I think that's too broad of a generalization. So yes, Brown v. Board of Education happened a generation ago, but our schools are more segregated now than they were then. We see this systemic destruction of public education at a time when the demographic shifts are turning toward brown. White people are very, very afraid about the demographic shifts in this country. So we see school choice, we see the privatization of schools, we see the school to prison pipeline, we see, I believe it was Missouri most recently that just passed a law that says fighting in schools will now be a felony. Your kid, whether they're a kindergartner or a 12th grader, and you have to look at that and say, well, why is that? Why did that take place in Missouri? You know, growing Latino population, still, you know, significant Black population. It's where Ferguson happened. You've got all these young people who are rising up and speaking out, and it also falls in line with the GOP strategy to disenfranchise voters of color, because if you can see these kids at an early age, give them felonies and so on and so forth, they can't grow up to vote against your policies, right? All of this stuff is very, very strategic. And, you talk about fair housing, but look at the violence of gentrification in cities like Charleston, in Washington, D.C., in New York. I mean, it's happening all over this country. So, yeah, this legislation has been passed, but racism is not something that is static. It keeps transforming. It's virulent. It's diabolical. It's sneaky, right? And so we have never had a moment in our history where we could just breathe and say, okay, here's some peace, some sunlight. It doesn't happen for us. I don't like the idea that, people think that Black folks have just become passive, right? I think this is an American story. Americans have been sort of blinded by consumerism, right? To consume more and more and more. And the whole language of race is used to obfuscate the economic conditions in this country and the kind of things that we are seeing going on in our political atmosphere, to say, okay, it's just Black people that have these problems, or Black people are the issue, or the people who talk about racism are the issue, rather than seeing that it's a very small minority of people in this country who are pulling, all the strings, who are calling the shots. I think African Americans are traumatized people. We are a people who have been serially traumatized over and over and over again. And we've been left over and over again to fend for ourselves. So I think people, and then there's the trauma we do to each other. So I think our trauma is the thing that has kept us from, taking up radical, solutions. Church, people go to church to pray, to get through the week, right, as a place of relief. But our preachers aren't, filling us up with any sort of radical ideas about how to dismantle, structural racism. They're not doing that. It's just let's keep up morale and let's get us through this life, and then in that great by and by, we will experience salvation and redemption in another life.
So let's do this, Dr. Patton, because we're coming up actually to near the end of the hour. By the way, this was supposed to be a 30-minute segment.
And I'm so pleased that it wasn't.
Absolutely. I don't know how we could have ever tried to contain this to 30 minutes. So I'd like to
barely an hour.
Right. We could still go on, but let's do this because we kind of touched on it earlier, but we've talked about Chicago violence here. We're out of Chicago, and I've always been of the mindset that, in the Black community, those things won't stop until we start loving one another. And that's really where I think we need to be. So, as far as the innocence of our children, if you could talk about why that's important and why, as a community, we need to love each other out of these situations.
Black childhood, Black children are the antidote to racism in all of its forms. That if we love our children, if we respect their bodily integrity, if we stop harming their brain development in terms of, stressing them out, subjecting them to chronic stresses, if we learn to feed our children healthy food instead of all this toxic garbage that comes into our communities, if we give them positive messages, if we stop telling them these negative things like you have to be twice as good as the white man. No, white people have to be half as good as the rest of us. That's the truth in this country, right? If we stop telling them that, oh, you're going to end up in prison and you're going to end up dead, filling their brains with negative messages. We already live in an ecosystem where every time our children are talked about, it's from a deficit perspective, from a deficit narrative, that they're problems, that they fail at this, and that. Our homes, our communities, even if you got to go to church, our church All of these institutions that we do control, right? Our homes and all these things have to be refuges. They have to be spaces of love and nurturing and empowerment, right? And we have to show examples. We have to have radical examples of Black people protecting our own children. We did it during Jim Crow. There are plenty of stories in the archives of Black people who fought back, who lynched white people who messed with their daughters and their children.
Right.
W.E.B. Du Bois during the Atlanta riot. There's a story of him sitting in front of his house to protect his infant daughter and his wife. Now everybody thinks it's W.E.B. Du Bois, Mr. Talented, Mr. Bourgeois, or whatever.
Right.
But during that riot, he stood there on his front porch with a shotgun, and he said, if anybody came here to mess with my wife and daughter, I was prepared to spill their guts all over this lawn. Now you think about that. And we need to do more of that in our communities to protect our children.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stacey Patton, for being on Humanity in the Headlines today. David, any closing thoughts?
I'm so glad we ended on that note, because that's what I was kind of alluding to. I didn't want to necessarily be that overt, but we've got to be.
You just wanted me to say it.
Well, I'm glad you said what I was thinking, because we've got to. The only solution to racism and the mistreatment of African Americans in 2017 is that we have to be willing to put our bodies on the line. It's easy to march. It's easy to protest. It's easy to pray. It's easy to sign a petition. It's easy to do something on Facebook. But when you put your life on the line, eventually that's the only solution.
If you could let our listeners know where they can find you and follow your works.
So you can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Stacey, S-T-A-C-E-Y, Patton, P-A-T-T-O-N. So at Dr. Stacey Patton on Twitter. You can go to my website, www.sparethekids.com. You can also buy my new book, which is just out a month, Spare the Kids, Why Whooping Children Won't Save Black America. And I'm also on Facebook.
I cannot tell you how honored, privileged we were to have you on today. Thank you so much for the wonderful information, and we definitely want you to remain a friend of the show, Dr. Patton.
Definitely. Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Have a great afternoon and a great rest of your weekend. Family, when I tell you from now on, you don't want to miss this one, and perhaps you will believe me in the future.
Right. And I'm so glad she brought up nutrition and food. To everyone who's listening, to all of our Facebook family, please stop feeding your kids Flaming Hots. We got to start somewhere. Man.
You done lost half the community right there.
Flaming Hot boycott starts today. You don't have to feed them apples or whatever, but let's get off of the Flaming Hots, please.
So next week, we will be back for another great episode of Humanity in the Headlines. We thank you so much for joining us today on Facebook Live, on YouTube, on IntellectualRadio.com, on iHeartRadio. We thank you so much for being with us. Thanks, Mr. Earl Winfrey, again, for this wonderful platform.
The man, the myth, the legend.
Thanks to our producer, Mr. Breon Jones, for putting together another wonderful show. We will see you next week on Humanity in the Headlines.